can you punish someone even though he doesn't exactly incite violence, but because the audience is so enraged, so provoked by the comments that they are likely to engage in violence? And the Supreme Court ultimately found that this was the conviction was a violation, but Jackson felt that it went too far. This decision went too far, and he said that it will risk turning the Constitutional Bill of Rights into a suicide pact. So here you see someone arguing for limiting free speech, not because they want to uphold white supremacy or the like, but because someone is worried about the coherence of democracy, including tolerance. The interesting thing is that the Terminiello decision would have an impact on a case called Edwards versus South Carolina. So this was one of many cases where the civil rights movement actually played an incredibly important role in expanding the protection of the First Amendment. Sometimes Americans have this idea that the First Amendment, from when it was ratified, just protected all kinds of speech. Of course, when you look at the history of America, there's lots of speech that has been prosecuted, restricted throughout history, and you really have to get into sort of the late 50s and 60s before you get the really sort of strong, robust protections that are enjoyed today. And many of these precedents were civil rights cases. And the interesting thing about this case is, so you have, I think, 187 African Americans who protest outside the Capitol in South Carolina, protesting against white supremacy. Perfectly peaceful protest, no violence, but the city planner and the police decide that this cannot go ahead because they fear that white South Carolinians will be offended and a breach of the peace will occur. So these people are arrested, and it goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules in favor of the protesters. And in that case, the court relies on Terminiello. So the very precedent that Robert H. Jackson was afraid would, become a suicide pact for the Constitution actually became a shield for persecuted minorities standing up for their rights. So to me, that's a powerful case for why principled free speech is important. And I think no one probably said it better than John Lewis, short before his death, said, without freedom of speech and the right to dissent, the civil rights movement would have been a bird without wings. So a powerful testament to how important free speech was to the fight for racial justice in this country. That man sitting right over there, Thurgood Marshall, first African-American Supreme Court Justice, was also someone who has a very good record in First Amendment cases. And I particularly like this quote: above all else, the First Amendment means that government has no power to restrict expression because of its message, its ideas, its subject matter, or its discontent. I don't think he wrote that opinion because he was a fan of bigotry, but because he believed that a principled protection of free speech was essential for persecuted minorities. But what about today? There are obviously still challenges with racism in this country, but a lot of things have happened. And so maybe you could argue that robust protection of free speech was necessary then, but now we face different challenges, and therefore we need to recalibrate the relationship between free speech and equality. But I would say that this would be a dangerous game, especially if you are sort of on the racial justice side. So this is a map which is a couple of years old, which shows predominantly conservative states that have proposed or enacted laws, prohibiting the teaching of divisive concepts on race, gender, and history. And you could say that they're sort of the distorted mirror image of hate speech bans that have become increasingly popular. You can also see that there's a tendency. So this executive order by the governor of Texas to fight anti-Semitism, using a definition of anti-Semitism which I think is pretty broad, which would say, for instance, that you cannot accuse Israel of applying double standards by requiring of it a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation, drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis, and so on. Now, these are, depending on where you stand on in this conflict, there's certainly been a huge uptick in anti-Semitic events, not only in this country, but also in Europe, including anti-Semitic hate crimes. But this is a good example of how hate speech laws can be expanded to cover discussions that are very relevant at the moment. And so obviously with the way the war is going right now, it should be permissible to criticize the state of Israel, even to use hyperbole. But we see here that an initiative which is couched sort of in hate speechy language can be used to crack down on a very inflated definition of what hate speech is that includes the policies of a state. What is interesting is that the First Amendment and courts have been bulwarks, I think, against this agenda. So it's not on race, but here in Tennessee, a federal judge temporarily blocked the drag ban, which is obviously adjacent to what we're talking about here. In Texas, a judge ordered books that had been removed, including books on race, to be reinstated because an order to remove them violated the First Amendment. And in Florida, the sort of anti-woke laws of Ron DeSantis, which also touch on race, have also been met with First Amendment challenges. So that, to me, is a good example that the calculus that you can sort of say free speech was a necessary part of the journey, but now we need to recalibrate, is a short-sighted one that is likely to backfire in the current environment, and that minorities are better off still relying on sort of the principled, robust protection of free speech. But I want to see if to not just look at the U.S. because obviously the question of equality and free speech is not confined to the U.S. Developments, believe it or not, also have happened in other parts of the world that might be relevant to our discussion. And I want to talk a bit about colonialism. And India is a good example. So in British accounts of colonialism, Britain brought free speech, press freedom, along with other enlightened values to its large empire. And so you could say that in the British account, the sun never set on press freedom. But that was, at the very least, a truth with a serious modification. As Indian nationalists started challenging British rule, Britain struck back with different laws. This includes a sedition law from 1870, and very interesting also, a criminalization of the promotion of feelings of enmity or hatred between different classes of Her Majesty's subjects. So here again, you see sort of a prototype of what we today would call a hate speech law. But it was very useful for the British because it could both sort of say if Hindus said something about Muslims or Muslims said something about Hindus, they could use that. Or if someone said something about the British, they could use this law as well. And numerous Indian nationalists were prosecuted under this, including one, Mahatma Gandhi, maybe the most prominent Indian and sort of the godfather of peaceful resistance to oppression. So Gandhi was prosecuted for sedition in a trial in 1921. And Gandhi is a very interesting example. Gandhi said of free speech and freedom of association that these were the lungs of liberty. And when he was tried, he gave a very eloquent speech that you can also look up online, where he said that affection cannot be manufactured or regulated by law. If one has no affection for a person or system, one should be free to give the fullest expression to his disaffection, so long as he does not contemplate, promote, or incite to violence. Now, this was in 1921. This comes close. It's not quite at the Brandenburg level that we know today under the First Amendment, but it's pretty close there. So basically, Gandhi says, unless you sort of encourage violence, free speech should be free. This is at the same time where in this country, the Supreme Court said, the First Amendment does not protect pacifists, radicals who peacefully oppose American involvement in World War I. You can send them to prison for 10 years, for 20 years for distributing pamphlets in New York. So you could say that Gandhi at this time had a much more radical conception of free speech than what was the prevailing idea of what free speech should extend to in America only around 100 years ago. How many of you have heard of the massacre in Paris of 17th October 1961? One person. So two persons. So there's a good reason why most of you have not heard of this. I'll get into it, but sort of, and this is still something that French historians battle over. But basically, what happened in the heart of the capital, where the French Declaration on the Rights of Man was written in 1789, in 1961, during the Algerian War for Independence, the French police issued an order saying that Algerian Muslims were curfewed between, I think, 8:30 p.m. and 5:30 a.m. So if you were Algerian, you were living in shanty towns outside Paris, you could not go outside. This is 1961. And so tens of thousands of Algerians decided to defy this order and go into the glitzy boulevards of Paris to peacefully protest this. This was women, children included. And they were not greeted by the French state upholding its principles under the French Declaration. Instead, they were shot upon, and some of them were bludgeoned with billy clubs, handcuffed, and thrown into the Seine, the river that goes through Paris, where they drowned. And we don't know the exact number of deaths. A very low number, which I don't think is reliable, says several dozens. A high number, which may be exaggerated, is 200 people who died on that evening. But why don't we know any more about it? Well, because the French police and the French state censored this dramatically. They also falsified records, and they refused access to historians, to archives up until the 1990s. So we have this absurd situation where, the people of France didn't know about what some historians have called the worst massacre in modern Western history, happening right in the shiny boulevards of the City of Lights, based on challenging an overtly racist policy adopted by the French state in order to quell anti-colonial sentiments. And here, this is an iconic picture, ici en noir les Algériens. Here is where we drown Algerians, because many Algerians drowned when they were thrown into the Seine after having been beaten and handcuffed. Back to Britain. So in Britain in 1965, the Race Relations Act was adopted, which prohibited incitement to racial hatred. And in many ways, this was an attempt to protect immigrants from colonies or former colonies. But what happened under the Race Relations Act was that the very first person to be prosecuted for this offense was a black man, and several other black people were prosecuted under the Race Relations Act, and including there were also actually anti-Nazi groups that were prosecuted. So what this again is a good example of how these laws that restrict free speech, even if adopted with good intentions, will always be defined and enforced by those who are in power at the time. And so if you're on the right side of that, you might say, well, good for me, too bad if you're on the other side. But if you're a minority, then typically you will not be on the side of those who get to ultimately decide it. And so it can be a gamble that backfires. South Africa is another, I think, really heinous example. So a little known fact, South Africa had its own index of forbidden literature with more than 20,000 titles. And they also had their own version of a hate speech law. So I've taken this quote from the Publications Appeal Board, which said that you have to make sure that what they publish does not assume the character of hateful attack on the white man. So in other words, if you were an author in South Africa, you or if you wrote something in South Africa, you could not attack white people. You could certainly attack black people. That happened on a daily basis. You could call them all kinds of things. But if you attacked the white South Africans, you'd be in trouble. So this was a good example of how censorship and repression was absolutely instrumental in apartheid South Africa. And shortly before Nelson Mandela, maybe the most iconic political prisoner in world history, won the first free and multiracial presidential election in 1994, he gave a speech where he said that the international community using free speech had been absolutely instrumental in dismantling apartheid, shining a light on what could, the injustices of apartheid that could not be said within South Africa could now, including through new technology, be shown, and that put so much pressure on apartheid South Africa that the system could no longer be upheld. And Mandela has this great quote that I've taken here. I won't read it, but you can read it for yourself. That really shows very much like Mandela, who he was like Gandhi, who of course he was inspired by, saw free speech as an essential weapon in the fight against discrimination. I want to see how much time I've spent so far. We do have more time. So I now want to turn to Europe and more contemporary Europe, or post-World War II Europe, which is the continent where I grew up, and where you will see that restrictions on free speech and the conception of free speech is very different from the prevailing conception under the First Amendment in the US, in that all European democracies have laws against hate speech and typically also other forms of restrictions that would be very difficult to sustain under the current interpretation of the First Amendment. And one of the main reasons for that is because of European history. It's because the Nazis came into power through democratic means, even if they never gained an outright majority, and because because that led to, of course, the Holocaust and the persecution of all kinds of groups. And so the idea, which has been expressed quite eloquently by someone like Karl Popper, the eminent political philosopher, in The Open Society and Its Enemies, Karl Popper, who wrote this in New Zealand while he was, had fled the Nazis, he said that if we're not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed and tolerance with them. So this is called the so-called paradox of tolerance. According to this logic, if you're a democratic society, it's very similar to what Robert H. Jackson said, sort of his experiences from prosecuting Nazis, sort of seeing what the Nazis had done with their words. Karl Löwenstein, another immigrant of the Third Reich, went to Columbia and wrote Militant Democracy and Fundamental Rights. And he was very harsh. He said that European democracies were so naive because they had just allowed totalitarian movements, fascists, to fester, even though their avowed aims were to overthrow democracy, and that they had been too lenient when it comes to free speech. They should have cracked down much more forcefully. But the history of the Weimar Republic, so that the short-lived German democracy that was in place from around 1918 to 1933, when the Nazis took over, shows, at least in my opinion, a different story that I call the Weimar fallacy. It's a term coined by Eric Heinze, a great British professor. I use it somewhat differently to him. So what you see in the Weimar Republic was that it was basically a very fragile democracy that was threatened both from the far left, communists, and from fascists. And what happened in the Weimar Republic was that the state became more and more desperate to try and crack down on these movements. And its principal aim of doing so, principal way of doing so, was to restrict free speech. So, for instance, it adopted a number of emergency laws that allowed the government to suspend newspapers if they publish false news or attack government officials. But the Nazis had a very clever way of exploiting this. So Joseph Goebbels, who later became propaganda minister, for instance, published a newspaper called the Angriff. The reason why he created this newspaper was because Adolf Hitler had a speaking ban in a number of German states. And so when this newspaper was confiscated by German authorities, Goebbels proudly proclaimed that the Angriff was the most frequently censored newspaper in Germany. The same with Julius Streicher, who was later executed, and his Der Stürmer. He was convicted twice, sent to prison for his writings, including anti-Semitic writings in Der Stürmer, and that was certainly sort of probably the most sickening anti-Semitic publication in world history. But he was basically greeted as a hero by his supporters when he was released from jail. And in the Nuremberg, the city where he was from, the Nazis, less than a year after his conviction, won a resounding victory. But even more damaging to the idea of a militant democracy, in my opinion, was that the Nazis were actually able to exploit the very instruments that were supposed to protect democracy in order to destroy it. So Article 48 of the Weimar Republic said that the president could suspend civil liberties in an emergency situation. So you could suspend, at the stroke of a pen, free speech, freedom of association, freedom of assembly, habeas corpus, and so on. And so when the Reichstag, the parliament building in Berlin, burned down, Hitler leaned on President Hindenburg to suspend it, and that really helped pave the way for the Nazis to ban all their opponents and institute, within 6 months, I would say, a totalitarian one-party state with no opposition, where they could use legal precedents that had been adopted during democratic times to put sort of a legalistic shine on their repressive methods. So in other words, the lessons of the Weimar Republic, this is my interpretation, this is not a universally agreed upon one, is not that this was free speech absolutism. The Nazis came in, exploited that, and then turned everything on its head. But nonetheless, this logic still governs to a large extent how Europe looks at free speech, including the European Court of Human Rights, which has sort of the final say on the interpretation of free speech in most European democracies. So the future of free speech, where that I direct, last year we did this study where we looked at free speech developments in 22 open democracies from 2015 to 2022. And we looked at speech restrictive developments and speech protective developments. And unfortunately, as you can see, the speech restrictive developments far outnumber the speech protective ones. And here you can see the 10 most common grounds for speech restrictive developments. So number one is intermediary obligations, in other words, ways to ensure that social media can be held to account. And number two was hate speech. So hate speech laws are very much in vogue in Europe. And I'll show you some cases that I think indicate the problematic nature of these. So here is a woman who was demonstrating in London. She's of South Asian heritage. She does not like the Prime Minister of the UK, nor the former Minister of Home Affairs, I believe she was, who are also of South Asian origin. And she had this sign, which clearly is offensive, calling them coconuts, which is a derogatory term. But she was arrested by police and investigated for sort of hate speech, which in the UK. In other words, a protection of the powerful against someone much less powerful than the prime minister and a sitting member of government. Another case where a black man in the UK was engaged in a discussion with a conservative, also black politician about a case where a police officer was prosecuted for killing a black person. And this discussion got heated, as it sometimes does on social media, and the person used a raccoon emoji and was arrested at his home, had his phone and laptop seized, was questioned for 8 hours and put on trial, was ultimately acquitted. But obviously that has quite a bit of a chilling effect on speech if this is the kind of things that you risk. This is nothing compared to Germany. Germany is, of course, the most militant of democracies in Europe. The New York Times in 2022 had a piece where they said that since 2018, more than 1,000 people have been charged or punished for online speech-related crimes. And very often this involves the police coming home at the crack of dawn, arresting you, seizing your laptop, seizing your phones in order to secure evidence. The types of speech that can fall under this is pretty broad. So in one instance, for instance, someone wrote to the local politician who had violated sort of COVID restrictions that he was, and I quote here, such a dick. And that was enough for the police to be sent to this person's home and arrest him. Another case is this Hans Burkhard Nix, who had a mixed-race daughter, and he complained that she was discriminated against, and he sort of on his blog posted a picture of an employee from an employment agency who he thought had discriminated against his daughter, and photoshopped it to look like Heinrich Himmler, prominent Nazi. And you're not allowed in Germany to use Nazi symbolism, and so he was convicted under that law, even though clearly he had no intention to support Nazism and sort of was playing the Nazi card, was engaging in hyperbole, but not advancing Nazism. So these are sort of a few cases of where this can get problematic. It's also interesting to note that in Germany in 2017, they adopted a law called the NetzDG, which said that social media platforms with more than 2 million users have to remove manifestly illegal content within 48 hours or risk a fine of up to 50 million euros. At the Future of Free Speech, we did a study and we showed that within a couple of years, more than 23 countries around the world had copy-pasted this law. This included Russia, Venezuela. So all these authoritarian countries, which obviously would have engaged in censorship anyways, but they copy-pasted this in order to gain legitimacy for their own restrictions, which makes it much more difficult for democratic states to criticize what goes on in these states, because you can say, well, we're just doing what the Germans are doing, so what's the problem? Even if they obviously implement it in ways that are much more restrictive than what's going on in Germany. So these are some of the unintended consequences of laws that are intended to ensure tolerance, equality, and respect for minorities, but that may not always result in that, or may at least have unintended consequences. And I want to finish on a personal note. So I told you about my father in the beginning. And he's since moved back to the Comoro Islands in East Africa, where he now sort of has a radio station and works in civil society. And in 2015, I think, he was organizing a protest against the government because the Comoro Islands is notorious for its bad governance, for its lack of basic services, power cuts, non-functioning roads, everything that's bad is there. And so my father organized this strike and protest, and he was arrested by the government. And the charge, inciting hatred. So a perfect example of the kinds of laws that some might have said should have protected him when he was faced by green jackets on the streets of Copenhagen. Those kind of laws can play into the hands of regimes that don't like any kind of dissent. And this is why I strongly believe that we are better to place our hopes with free speech as an important guarantee for tolerance. Now, free speech is an experiment. There's no guarantee that the outcome will always be good. But I think that looking at history, it's a noble experiment. And I think that without free speech, our future is likely to be less democratic, less tolerant, and less just. So thank you very much for those for your attention.
Yeah, if there are any questions, we have the mic to pass around.
Hello, thank you for your wonderful talk. It was very enlightening, and I really appreciated it in the nuances. So, one thing about our university is our university loves to talk about how much it loves free speech. Vanderbilt loves to talk about it. But right now, they are punishing the students who are standing up for free speech because of their criticism of what Israel is doing in Gaza. Students have been arrested. Many were detained for several hours overnight, deprived of food, water, medication, and medical treatment, access to the restroom. They were not allowed to, women were not allowed to change their period products in private, so they had to do it in front of other people. And this is what our university has done because the students wanted to meet with the chancellor, but he refuses to meet with them so that they can reinstitute a vote on student funding. So what are we to do when the university says, well, we're private, we don't have to follow the First Amendment, but they don't even follow the rules that they've laid out? What then?
Yeah, thanks for putting me on the spot.
Welcome. I love to do it.
So we put out a statement, but we focused mostly on the reporter that was arrested, where it, based on the facts available to us, seemed to be a disproportionate response to a reporter covering it. There's now this investigation ongoing that I hope will result in something meaningful. When it comes to the students, so I've seen one video. I've seen the one where they sort of push the security guard. That I think everyone agrees is not free speech. Also smashing a window and attacking, as I've been told, sort of pushing a member of the administration. That to me is not peaceful protest. I think that to me, one of the questions that I've seen, and I don't know the extent of it, is that this boil over partly because the sort of time, place, manner restrictions on protest have been extended, have been defined so broad that it makes it very difficult to protest. I don't know the extent of those restrictions, whether that's a legitimate complaint, but that's definitely something that's important to look into, because time, place, manner restrictions, I think, are reasonable in many cases, because they don't, it's not, they don't look at sort of, it's not about the content or the viewpoint. It's just saying you can't disrupt, essential functions for the university. But if you say that within 200 meters or whatever you can't protest, then it sort of defeats the purpose of peaceful protest. I don't have a good answer on whether the university has gone too far. What I will say is that I think that a subject like Israel-Palestine should obviously be something that students have a right to debate vigorously and also protest, but not using physical force. That's I think is an important to distinguish between peaceful protest and using force. So that was maybe not as clear an answer as you had liked, but best I could do.
In the front, one sec.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. So we talked a little bit in our First Amendment seminar about how maybe as compared to like the history of the First Amendment, speech has perhaps become more dangerous because of its ability to be amplified, and then also with like algorithms, people like kind of get into an echo chamber. So what do you say in response to that?
Yeah, I don't know that we have. I mean, so, like I said, speech can certainly lead to harmful acts. You know, January 6th is another example. You know, it wouldn't have happened without speech. It wouldn't have, or at least it was probably unlikely that would have happened without speech. And it was, you know, lies and conspiracy theories amplified on social media blogs and so on. So that was an example where speech led to violence. But does social media lead to more violence than before? I don't know that there's robust evidence for that. Also, I think there's actually quite a bit of research that challenges the filter bubble hypothesis that sort of suggests that people who get most of their news online actually tend to get more different viewpoints than those who get it through traditional media. And I think what you see online is that it's a relatively small group of hardcore partisans who are most likely to spread sort of hate speech and disinformation, but we have a tendency to think that it's sort of more widespread than it is. And of course, because they have the means to sort of to amplify a few voices, it seems like it's more people than it is. But I think you know, if you want to look at America and American politics, a good rule of thumb is to sort of note to yourself every 30 seconds that Twitter is not America, right? You know, this country is not represented by whatever trends on X or Twitter. There's actually a lot more nuanced and thoughtful things out there. Although I also get a lot of good content social. I don't think, you know, this is an interesting question. You know, would you rather be back in the days of Walter Cronkite, where supposedly news was sort of neutral and you'd get sort of the facts and nothing more, or would you rather live in today's era of social media? Ask the Algerians in Paris. You know, ask the Algerians in Paris. Like, if you look at New York Times coverage of what happened in Paris, they said it was sort of riotous, 4 people died, the Algerians spread propaganda. You could not have had 200 people, let's say that was the number, people killed by the police in the streets of Paris with almost no mentioning in today's age of social media, because everyone would have had a smartphone. They would have streamed it. The bodies floating down the river would have been documented. There's no way you could have hit that today. I mean, veering a bit off topic, but one of the theses in my book that you're welcome to buy online is that every time there's a communication revolution in communications technology, there's this phenomenon of elite panic. So those who are the institutional gatekeepers tend to panic about letting new voices into the ecosystem of information and ideas. And you see that with the printing press, you see it with the telegraph, radio, and so on. And we're living through it right now. And that doesn't mean that there's nothing bad going on, but I think that sometimes we have this negativity bias where we zoom in on all the harms and we forget all the benefits that we reap from free speech and other fundamental values.
So I haven't done much research on this, but I did see an article in the news recently about, I believe it was Florida, passing a law restricting the ability of young people, 14-year-old or less, to access social media. So what would you say about those kinds of laws and just in general, the prospect of sort of time, place, and manner restrictions on social media?
Yeah, so I think the Florida and Texas case, the net choice cases, I think I can sort of see where, you know, you have this idea that these platforms have become so dominant, and they have an outsized influence on the practical exercise of free speech. They're private companies, so the First Amendment doesn't apply to them, and so we just want to make sure that they don't remove content that was based on the First Amendment. But ultimately, I fear, so you have one social media law in Texas, then California adopts one. You think the politicians and the people adopting and enforcing those laws are going to target the same thing in California and Texas in this polarized environment in this country? I would be highly skeptical of that. So I ultimately think that it's better not to focus on sort of government restrictions or sort of government imposing things, and try to work with more technological solutions. So we're very proud to work with the Data Science Institute here at Vanderbilt on an app that we call the Frequalizer. So it's sort of a tool for counter speech, which is supposed to serve people in civil society organizations that they can more easily counter hate speech online. Of course, there are all kinds of other things where you could regulate. You could think of antitrust. I'm not an expert on that, so don't ask follow-up questions, please. But should these platforms have been allowed to grow to the size they have today? Can we do another thing that we're working on is sort of a more distributed content moderation platform. So that would allow users to have more input over what kind of content they're confronted with, rather than saying governments or big companies should have a say, should be sort of the centralized choke points of information. I would be more comfortable exploring those roads rather than saying, we will adopt a law which mandates social media platforms to allow this kind of content and not that kind of content, and that I think will almost inevitably be skewed for political reasons in the various states, and creating sort of a patchwork of speech restrictive laws around the country.
Sadly, we are out of time, but I hope that you will join me in giving a round of applause to say thank you. And also thank you again to all of you for coming, and I hope you carry these thoughts and messages with you as you think about free speech here on campus and in the community writ large. Good luck on finals.